Students of Civ 1. Going to be talking with you about the Roman Kingdom period, particularly getting into the foundation myth, right? Romulus, Remus, and the founding of Rome. It's going to be the title of the lecture today. And I'm just going to go into the mythological beginnings of Rome. If you haven't already, go back and listen to my previous lecture video over Italian geography, pre-Roman Italy, and the Etruscans. Now, much like the Etruscans, lack incredible historical evidence for us to know for sure how Rome was founded. A lot of the history we get comes from later historians, and ones that are most commonly cited, like Livy, and others too, come from later historians from the empire who are attempting to sort of come up with a foundation story just in order to understand how Roman civilization got to the point that it did. So there's not a lot of evidence to let us know about the founding, but I'm going to go into the foundation myth as much as possible. And I will be kind of doing this in a compository manner. Again, my main sources for this information would be Plutarch, Livy. I had a moment in the previous video where I went all into sources, so review that. But Virgil on some of the earlier stuff, and the Trojan refugee story. So, but we're gonna go into Romulus and Remus today. Okay, so the foundation of Rome, it's a mystery. But the story we have blends a lot of legend and myth together. Okay, so tradition states that there's a total of 7 Roman kings in the kingdom period, and that the period of monarchy lasts from 753 to 509 BC. So that is going to be the theme of this. Now, I'm doing this lecture and then another later lecture on the last 3 Roman kings, which are actually Etruscan, and they're called the Tarquin dynasty, or the Tarquins. Now, there's going to be a period at one point in the kingdom period where there's a joint monarchy that we will discuss, and that would actually lead us to the conclusion that there's actually 8 kings, but the official number that we will use, as tradition states, is 7. So, following the rule of Aeneas and many subsequent generations of kings, right? So you have this Latin kingship at Alba Longa for generations. And then there is a king who comes to power named Numitor. He had a brother named Amulius, and the brother wanted to become king, eventually seizes power from Numitor and takes over the throne. Numitor gets exiled and all of his sons killed by Amulius, and his only daughter, Rhea Silva, I believe it was his only daughter, but his daughter, Rhea Silva, is forced to become what is called a Vestal Virgin. Okay, I will talk about Vestal Virgins a little more later, but these are virgins who are recruited in childhood to serve this 30-year period where they keep this fire burning is a part of this sort of priestess cult to Vesta, the god of hearth and home. So she could have no children if she is a Vestal Virgin, and the issue is Amulius doesn't want Rhea Silva or any of Numitor's offspring to challenge him for the throne one day. Rhea Silva is raped, which at the time was seen as a crime. So, but her giving birth to 2 boys, after that, she is imprisoned. Now, she claims that the father of the 2 children is Mars, the god Mars. Now, the twins are to be drowned in the river Tiber after they are born. The Tiber is flooded when these soldiers take the children to the river, put them in some shallows. The children do not drown. The flood waters recede, and the two boys are still alive. This is when the legend of Romulus and Remus and the she-wolf comes in. So, according to this legend, this tale, this is when a she-wolf comes down to the river to drink, finds the babies, suckled them until they were found by a herdsman. The herdsman finds him. Herd is basically caring for these two young boys. So the herdsman and his wife raised Romulus and Remus. Now, one day, Remus is captured and taken to a local landowner and is accused of stealing cattle. Okay, so coincidentally, this landowner is his grandfather, Numa. So Numa is told by the people who brought Remus in that he has a twin brother, and he begins inquiring about about Remus and these boys' upbringing, and he begins to suspect that they may be his grandchildren. So it's discovered that Numa is their paternal or maternal grandfather. And then after this, Romulus and Remus hatch a plan to restore Numa to the throne and lead an attack on Amulius, ultimately killing him. So after Numa is restored to the throne, Romulus and Remus go on to found the city of Rome at the location in the Tiber River where they had been drowned. So that's where you get your explanation of why Rome was built where it was built. So let's kind of think about that in this manner that these later historians are trying to explain. Well, okay, Rome had this period of kings. Who was the first king, right? So a lot of scholars really would argue that Romulus is a mythical figure, right? That he may be based on a real person, but the history that we will go into is very much so rooted in mythology. Now let's go into the founding of Rome. So tradition also states, like their 7 kings, that Rome was founded by twin brothers named Romulus and Remus in 753 BCE. Now, these twin brothers will not be the joint monarchy in Rome. So, a little bit about the location of Rome. The city is located on the western coast of Italy. It's not right on the coast. It's actually 15 miles inland on the Tiber River, but on the western side there of Italy. 15 miles inland from the Mediterranean. This is good for trade and commerce, and it also is very good for defense because people would have to come 15 miles inland to attack. Now, where the Tiber moved through the city was very low and marshy. Rome is built on and around 7 hills. And people constructed dwellings on these hilltops. Excavations of these hills have revealed dwellings dating to the time period of the Roman Kingdom period, so that gives us some actual historical context. The hills are Carinal, Viminal, Capitoline, Esquiline, Palatine, Aventine, and Callian. Palatine and Aventine, I'm going to make more comments on in the future. But those are the names of your 7 hills. Over time, the Romans began to drain the swamps and the marshy areas around the city. That's just a little bit of context on the history of the city. This is an engineering feat that the Romans likely learned from Etruscan engineers, and that is just channeling of these swamps and marshy areas in the city, around the city, and flowing through the city into these underground sewers. And again, that is likely imported from the Etruscan engineers and the neighbors of the Romans. Early Romans are very primitive, tribal, and they had a lot to learn from their neighbors, like the Etruscans. So, the two brothers, Romulus and Remus, eventually begin to quarrel over who should be the king. And this will lead to an argument in which there's a couple of different tellings on how this will be dealt with, okay? So they begin to quarrel over who should be, like, I guess you could say, the supreme leader, right? They both of them wants to be a little more in charge than the other. So this would be left to the early priest who inhabited Rome to decide who would be king. Each brother was placed on a hilltop to wait in this account, and Romulus is put on Palatine Hill and Remus on Aventine Hill. Birds flocked over Romulus, being a sign that he would become the first king of Rome. Now, in one account, 6 vultures land at Remus's feet first, and then 12 vultures land at Romulus's feet next. So primacy of arrival versus the primacy of number is the contentious point between the two. And a fight ensues between them in which Romulus will kill Remus. One account, Remus is mocking his brother and leaps over Romulus's walls, right? Sort of in a show of disrespect. And this is when Romulus kills him. So in both stories, Romulus killing his brother is a common thread. Regardless of what happens, Romulus becomes ascendant and the sole leader of Rome after the death of Remus. His name, Romulus, supplying the convenient name for the city. So Rome eventually will grow to dominate all of its neighbors, all of the Italian peninsula, and eventually the entire Mediterranean world. So humble beginnings, or humble a creation of humble beginnings by these historians, particularly Roman historians writing this story. But nonetheless, let's get into Romulus, the first king of Rome, and what his reign entailed. So Romulus, his date for the founding of Rome is April 21st, 753 BCE, right? And he will rule from April 21st, 753 BCE to 716 BCE. Romulus welcomed foreigners, social outcasts, criminals. Anybody essentially was welcomed to migrate to Rome. It was very open, and it became a town of fugitives, escaped slaves, debtors, and just criminal types. Due to this violent and backward reputation of the Romans, the city is shunned by many of the neighboring tribes. Now, one of Romulus's first orders of business, and we'll talk much about the expansion of the Roman military, but one of his first orders of business is to create an army. Romulus organized and divided up his able-bodied men for the first Roman legions, which in his time would consist of 1,000 infantrymen and 100 cavalrymen. Later, that number will triple as Rome begins to grow in size. Now, only the richest members of society would serve in the cavalry, as they were the only ones who could afford the horses. All right, we'll talk about the equestrian class of citizens more when we get into the Roman Republic and into that period of history. Now, Romulus then created a council of 100 senators to help advise him and govern the citizens of Rome. The assembly was called a senate, from the Latin word senex, meaning old man. So throughout the remainder of the kingdom period, the king would be advised by this council of elders called the Fathers, the Patris in Latin, which literally means fathers. Now, this is only an advisory body, but it was very powerful, okay? And it would become more powerful as history progresses. These individuals from the Senate came from the most powerful families in Rome. Most senators in Rome's early hereditary aristocracy are known as patricians. They're the ruling elite, much like the eupatrids that I discuss in Greece, these well-fathered people. Now, the patricians would monopolize the Senate, the priesthoods also, and they would refuse to intermarry with people from the bulk of Roman society who were called the plebeians, or the plebeians. The plebeians were ordinary people. They were free. Some of them were even wealthy. And the Romans refer to these two social classes, the patricians and the plebeians, as orders. These two classes, as we go into the Republic, will be constantly at odds with one another. And here are sort of their early origins. Now, there is an event that has been heavily mythologized called the rape of the Sabine women, right? A French painter, David, has painted this from the French Revolutionary era, and there have been many people who've remarked on this story. Now, again, this is likely a story to attempt to explain how Rome began to grow from just being the city of men. Okay, so early on, the population's overwhelmingly male. There are very few women living in the city. That's going to be a problem if you want to survive as a city for future and subsequent generations. That problem's going to have to be solved. So the Romans begin asking tribes for the right to intermarry, but they're refused. Okay, so Romulus conceives a plan that the Romans are going to hold this religious festival to Neptune, and in which Rome would invite members of local tribes to. This is when the legend of the rape of the Sabine women will take place. Okay. Now, this is likely a legend from Roman mythology which attempts to mitigate the problem of there being no or few women in Rome, it being misproportional male to female ratio. So conveniently, Romulus has a solution for this problem, like many other problems. And the Sabines were one of these neighboring tribes that refused to intermarry with the Romans. So at this religious festival, many different tribes attended. Now, the Romans, during the festival, seize all the women that they could, and then they drive the men and the parents out of the city after capturing their women. Now, Roman historian Livy's account of this event sees Romulus talking with each woman individually after the fact, promising them property rights and other civil rights if they would marry these men of Rome and become citizens of Rome. He tells the women their parents are at fault for this, that they were only abducted because of their pride, and Romulus said that they would be treated better in Rome than anywhere else in Italy. So the Romans and the local tribes who they abducted these women from fought. Romulus repels each attack. Okay, so the Sabines, they had not attacked initially. They are planning. One day the Sabines are able to sneak into the city, and Romulus launches a counterattack, but neither side gains the advantage. Now, eventually, the Sabine women intervene in this conflict, right? So here's what Livy says in regards to what the Sabine women, who basically just imagine sort of fighting taking place and them just kind of like breaking it all up, right? So, we are mothers now, they cried. Our children, your sons, your grandsons. Do not put on them the stain of parricide. If our marriage, if the relationship between you is hateful to you, turn your hatred to us. We are the cause of strife. On our account, our husbands and fathers lie wounded or dead, and we would rather die ourselves than be widowed or orphaned. And again, that's an account from Livy. So after this event, the Romans and the Sabines agree to unite as one nation, with a Sabine king ruling jointly alongside Romulus named Titus Tatius. Okay, so that's going to be the joint monarchy of Titus Tatius and Romulus. It's going to last for 5 years before Titus Tatius is killed by an angry mob. So again, this would mean that there really going to be 8 total kings if you count Titus is one of the kings of Rome. Okay, so we've got Romulus, and then we've got this joint monarchy with Romulus. But after Titus's death, Romulus ruled the combined kingdom, the Sabines and the Romans, alone until his death. During that time, Rome waged war on their neighbors throughout the remainder of his reign, particularly the Etruscans to the north. So Romulus divided Rome into 3 primary tribes. So just think about this in thirds, and there obviously would be some disenfranchised groups. But the Romans, the Sabines, and then a third group that was heavily infused with Etruscans. And this is done mostly for taxation purposes, but also for military purposes. 100 Sabines are added to the Roman Senate, bringing the number to 200. Romulus then formed the first great citizen assembly of 10 curia, each named for one of the Sabine women who had been captured. These were like wards or districts that were presided over by an official known as a curio. Each curia was responsible for providing 100 soldiers, known as a century. This would mean each tribe would provide around 1,000 soldiers and 100 cavalry. So that's going to be where you get your 3,000 foot soldiers or infantrymen, and then your 300 cavalry being the presumed numbers on the first, some of the earlier conglomerations of the Roman legions. So after Romulus dies in 716 BCE, it is agreed upon, after some arguments, that the next king would be of Sabine descent. So let's talk about that. The Romans had become a regional power by the time of Romulus's death. He had reigned for 37 years. Of his death, it is told that he disappeared in a whirlwind during a sudden storm which had formed over him while he was reviewing some plans of attack with his troops. So Livy states that Romulus may have been murdered by senators, but a more mythological account of his death, also by Livy, states that Romulus ascended to heaven during a storm to be beside the god of Mars. So 2 accounts there. Now, members of the Senate run Rome for 1 year after Romulus died. Right? So that is one thing to remark on. Now, I'll make some more comments about the Sabine king that will take Romulus's place in a moment, but let's remark again on Romulus is this mythological figure before we move on. So Rome is running, is being run by the Senate after Romulus's death, and looking back at his life, we could very likely conclude, or it would be reasonable to assume, that Romulus is representative of a sort of an archetype. An archetype is a recurrent symbol or motif in literature, art, or mythology. So in this account, Romulus was unable to be located by the senators that stood beside him during the storm. That being sort of the mythological side of the account, right? But it could be interpretive. Now, the Romulus and Remus myth give the Romans an origin story for their civilization. So that's where he could serve as this sort of archetype of the creator of Rome, but also as the ruler. It's Romulus who gives the Romans their city, the name of the city, the legions, the Senate, the citizen assembly, the organization of the tribes. That's all accredited to Romulus. So could Romulus be based on a real person or real people? Yes. But it's much more likely that he's an invention in later times by the Romans who are attempting to explain and answer questions about Roman civilization in the past. Like many kings that we're going to be discussing, it's very likely that Romulus is a mythical figure which has some historical context that he may be based upon. A real person, a real people. So let's talk about Numa Pompilius. He's the second king of Rome. He's going to rule from 715 after that 1 year period from 673 BCE. Now, Sabines were refusing any Roman candidates for kingship. Romans also rejected any Sabine candidates. So we have a problem. Now, each senator in Rome reigned for a single day for the entire year until a compromise was reached. The compromise stated the Romans could pick anyone they desired to be king as long as the king was of Sabine descent. Numa Pompilius is chosen by the Romans, much to the delight of the Sabines. Numa did not live in the city of Rome, and he actually had a bit of a disdain for all of the violence and greed and just the reputation and image that Rome had acquired by that time. Now, of Numa, the Greek biographer Plutarch says that the next king of Rome was born on April 21st, 753 BCE. So that's Plutarch's date for Numa's birth. Very convenient date, being the exact date that Romulus founded the city of Rome. Now, he is the son-in-law of the Sabine king, Titus Tatius. So another thing to remark on, and he's chosen to become the king by Rome, but by the Senate in Rome. Pompilius, you could, if you read about him, you get the gist that he's kind of a monk type character. He'd withdrawn from society, lived in the countryside. He didn't want to rule, and they pretty much had to convince him to come be king. They offered him power, riches, and he declines, but eventually decides to become king. This is a story of many people, and that's going to be a reoccurrent theme that we'll talk about with Cincinnatus in Roman history, but also that is the idea of many people who rule. They refuse the kingship to appear humble, right? We see this happen in United States history many times of people sort of stating that those things were thrust upon them. So Numa would be sort of considered the father of Roman culture. Okay, so let's talk about that. He devoted his life to religious contemplation before becoming king, and he established many religious rituals and festivals for Rome. He is a pacifist. He didn't seek to go to war. He sought peace and solitude, and he would just greatly change the trajectory of Rome. Now, he's almost the complete opposite of Romulus, if you think about it, in almost every way. Sort of like a heads and tails, right? Romulus is a warrior king, and kills his brother, and you've got this monk-type ruler who had power thrust upon him, and who doesn't want to rule, and it's very interesting to look at them in contrast. He devised religious rituals and instilled fear and awe of the gods in the Romans. All right. According to both Livy and Plutarch, Numa began the cult of the Vestal Virgins. Okay, so I mentioned Vestal Virgins with Rhea Silvia. So that is another sort of thing to remark on. Something that I've been looking into a little bit is trying to explain basically how there could be Vestal Virgins as a tradition in Rome under predating Romulus's reign. Well, Rome wasn't a city, but in Alba Longa, if that was an imported tradition. But both Livy and Plutarch say Numa began the cult of the Vestal Virgins in Rome. This could have been imported from their neighbors. But he established the laws for the priestesses and the priesthood of Vesta to watch over the eternal flame. Okay, this eternal flame was to be kept burning indefinitely, and if it went out, it was not to be restarted with the flame of another fire. It was to be restarted by using the reflection of the sun's rays with a mirror. So the sacred and eternal flame was the fire of Vesta. Vesta was the virgin goddess of hearth and home and of family. Now, a little bit more about the Vestal Virgins. Numa appointed 2 Vestal priestesses. This number eventually grows to 4 and then 6. The Vestals are recruited as children from highborn Roman families as early as age 6, and they would serve for 30 years, and then they would retire and be allowed to marry, and held a very high esteem in society. Numa also created the office of Pontifex Maximus. This is the high priest of Rome, who was responsible for overseeing all of these religious services and activities. He would be who would select the Vestal Virgins for the priesthood. Now, Numa refused to hold the role of Pontifex Maximus. He refused, he didn't think that the king should hold that role. He wanted that to stay constant, and it would stay constant until the dawn of the Roman Empire under Augustus, when this title, like many other titles, emperors would acquire for themselves. At the end of the empire, this title was passed to the popes, who hold it to this day. Numa created priesthoods and built religious monuments. He also created religious holidays or holy days. So that is his major sort of contribution to Roman society. He also constructed temples to Janus. All right, that's one thing that he is known for as a part of his legacy. And interesting tradition about the Temple of Janus in relation to this Roman history moving forward from this date is that the doors of this temple stayed shut during all of Numa's reign. And that is a symbol for peace. When Rome is at peace, the temple doors in the Temple of Janus remain shut. And they would remain open for much of Roman history following Numa's reign, when Rome would be at war. Now, Numa found Rome, this warring and divided city, violent, backward, and left Rome a peaceful and religious city of farmers and priests. Now, it's not going to be widely popular with all. Okay, so let's start getting into our next few kings. So Numa, so you have Romulus, you have Numa, first and second king of Rome. Titus Tatius, also joint ruling with Romulus. But the official third king of Rome rules from 673 to 642 BCE. And this man's name is Tullus Hostilius. Okay. Now, Tullus is a very warlike king. He wages war constantly against neighboring tribes. Change and just reverse this image of Rome that Numa had created, and do his best to do that. He's not very religious. He paid very little attention to religious observances throughout most of his reign. One of the highlights of his reign was his defeat of Alba Longa. Now, after being defeated by the Romans, Alba Longa for a time will become a type of a vassal state to Rome. But after disloyalty by the king of Alba Longa, according to accounts, Tullus destroys Alba Longa and depopulates citizens to Rome, which would lead to the growth of the city. Tullus also was successful in battle against the Etruscan city of Veii. He dies in 642 BCE after a 32-year reign. Now, a little about his death. He had paid very little attention to religious matters, as I mentioned, throughout his reign. But near the end of his reign, there's some sickness going around. He becomes very superstitious. Now, Dionysius, this is somebody I mentioned in my last video about when I was getting into my sources for these lectures. he gives two accounts of Tullus's death. In one account, after becoming ill, Tullus seeks to perform these rituals that had been suggested by Numa for, the situation he was in. Again, Numa's no longer around, but he had created all these religious traditions. Now, according to Dionysius, Tullus performs the ritual incorrectly. This angers Jupiter, and in this myth, lightning strikes the house of Tullus, killing him and his entire family, burns it down. Now, a second telling of Tullus's death says that this is what happened. That the followers of who would be the next king, Sabine, named Ancus Marcius, would kill Tullus. That they killed Tullus and his entire family after going to his house and managing to get inside with weapons, and they kill his family and burn his house to the ground. Now, after the reign of Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius is chosen as the fourth king of Rome. And he is going to be the second, technically the third, if you recount Titus, Sabine king of Rome. Now, Ancus will be the last king we'll be discussing that is not of Etruscan descent. That's one thing else I want you to remark on. Now, Rome's neighbors began working tirelessly to defeat the Romans after this point. Okay, so that's going to be something that Ancus is going to have to deal with. Now, Ancus Marcius, fourth king of Rome, 642 BCE to 617 BCE. He is the grandson of former Sabine king Numa Pompilius. Now, he's chosen by the Senate to become the next king of Rome, and his succession will be challenged by a confederation of different Latin communities. Again, Rome's neighbors trying to prevent them from becoming too powerful. So Ancus leads the Roman army and defeats the confederated tribes. He then depopulates the towns, repopulates them, the towns that he took people from, with loyal Romans. So Rome is starting to grow and spread out. Now, after he defeats these Latin tribes, a conflict ensues with the Etruscans of Veii yet again, in which Rome is victorious and able to gain some new territory in that conflict, which clears the way for them to found a port city named Ostia, which would give Rome major access to the Mediterranean. Now, Ancus Marcius is a great king, builder king. He constructed Rome's first aqueducts. He's very prosperous in his reign of 24 years, and he is followed by three Etruscan kings known as the Tarquin dynasty. Okay, so the Tarquins I will go into great detail on in a next lecture, talk a little bit about the transition of power from Ancus Marcius to the Etruscans, and that will be a theme for another lecture. So, as if you have any questions on any of this, please feel free to drop this in the comments if you're listening on YouTube, or you can shoot me an email, wilson@uaccm.edu. Thank you again for listening, everybody. We will talk to you soon.